Good afternoon and welcome to Humanities Montana's virtual panel on our rural-urban political divide. My name is Randy Tanglin and I'm the Executive Director of Humanities Montana. This is the second in a series of 4 virtual panels for our Why It Matters initiative on civic and electoral participation. Humanities Montana is, of course, a nonpartisan organization. Today's panel attendance indicates that humanities have much to offer our diverse Montana communities. In our conversations with Montanans all around the state, we at Humanities Montana have found that there's a real hunger for the context and multiple perspectives that the humanities can bring to the pressing issues of our day. We also hear Montanans expressing a desire for healthy, respectful, and civil discourse around difficult conversations. We believe that this is possible, and today we bring you 3 different voices of experience and expertise to explore the nuances of our rural-urban political divide in Montana. I thank our 3 panelists and our moderator in advance for the conversation and insight they offer us today. And I thank all of you in the audience for being part of Humanities Montana's Why It Matters initiative. Our program officer, Samantha Dwyer, will now tell you what to expect from this Zoom panel, and she'll introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you all of you for joining us for our second panel in this series. These programs were funded by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative, administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Tonight's program will be a conversation with 3 panelists, Laura Nelson, Rob Saldin, and Germaine White, moderated by Amy Martin. Laura is a freelance journalist and author of Legacies, The Values, Principles, and Purpose of the Montana Farm Bureau Federation. She has previously covered rural communities as an award-winning journalist and edited the Big Timber Pioneer. Rob Saldin is the director of the Mansfield Center's Ethics and Public Affairs program and a professor of political science at the University of Montana. His most recent book, Never Trump, The Revolt of the Conservative Elites, co-authored with Stephen Teals, has been well received across the political spectrum. Germaine White is the director of Native Engagement at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. She also served as an educator and cultural resource manager for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes for over 30 years. Working for tribal government has allowed her to build bridges of understanding across cultures with a diverse group of individuals, organizations, and government. Our moderator for the conversation with these 3 panelists is Amy Martin. Amy is a journalist, a philosopher, and the host of Threshold, a public radio show and podcast that investigates pressing environmental issues in depth. In 2016-17, Amy was a Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado. Amy was raised on an Iowa farm, and I'll let Amy tell you a little bit more about her background on the rural-urban divide and take the conversation from here.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks to everybody for being here. Thanks to Humanities Montana for initiating and hosting this whole series of conversations. That was the first time I've been introduced as a philosopher, and I'm pretty excited about it. So thank you for that. I'll take it. I did study philosophy in undergrad, but I think that might be the first time it made its way into an intro. So thanks. It's fun seeing people typing in the chat where they're from, and I'm seeing places big and small all over Montana and also other parts of the country. So keep chiming in. Let us know where you are right now or where you consider home. And that's actually something that I kind of wanted to expand on Sam's invitation there and invite you to respond a little further in the chat as we get this conversation going. I'm curious, if someone asks you where you're from, what do you say? And that recognizing that this might be different from where you are currently living right now. And that is kind of what I wanted to start with, just sort of as full disclosure in terms of where I'm from and how I answer that question. And I actually find myself sometimes a little bit torn on how to respond when I'm asked where I'm from, because I've been in Montana, I've been in Missoula since around the year 2000. And so in some ways that very much feels like where I'm from and what feels like home to me. But I grew up in Iowa on a farm outside of a small town. And there's something about that rural identity that imprints very deeply. And maybe that's true no matter where you're from, but I almost feel like a sense of betrayal if I say, oh, I'm from Montana. I always feel like I have to put the asterisk, but I grew up in Iowa. Or I say, well, I'm from Iowa, but I live in Montana. And then I often do feel the need to specify, I'm not just from Iowa, I'm from a farm in Iowa. And I don't exactly know what that's all about, but for me, it definitely, there's something there about like this loyalty and this identity of being rural, at least originally. Um, and I think that that's something that I'd like to hear from our panelists as well, in terms of how they identify. Um, but I'd kind of like to start, panelists, by just defining more in general terms what it is we're talking about when we say the rural urban divide. If we're going to talk about it, we need to know what it is. So can each of you say from your perspectives, what is the rural urban divide, and how do you experience it in your lives or in your work now? Um, any of you three panelists want to chime in?
Amy, I'll go ahead and start. I too identify similar to you. I grew up in Western Nebraska on my family's farm, and have lived in Montana for almost 9 years now, also in a rural community. But I too have that same urging that you mentioned to let people know that that's my background and that's part of my identity. And I think that's probably something that we all share. But I think when I think of the rural urban divide, I first want to try to define what rural or urban really means, or what we're talking about. And I think there are three ways that I've thought about it as I've thought about this conversation. When we look statistically, what I found is that most folks define a rural community as one with less than 2,500 people in its population. So that's one definition that I found. I think when you come to a rural community like the one that I live in today, Big Timber, you get a more dictionary definition of rural, right? Rural is people who live in the country, not people who live in town, even if it is a small town, right? So then says then you're more rural. But then you get out in the country, and I think especially more so all the time as more people come out to live in the country, there's another divide out there in the country, right? Where it's like, well, there's people who live in the country because we're making a living here. And then there's people who just live in the country. So like there's these layers of ruralness that I'll start with and say that my job and my work is primarily with the rural people. So I think those are all different ways we can think and talk about rural when we open up this conversation.
That is so interesting, Laura, and I really appreciate that. And I think it gets right into the heart of something that I'd like to explore further, in terms of that rural is not just one thing, just like urban is not just one thing. So yeah, thanks for that framing. And Germaine or Rob, do you want to talk about how you think about what the rural urban divide even is, and how you relate to it personally?
Well, sure. I'll go next. It is, I should say first, great to be with you all. See so many people out there from all over the state and beyond. But look, I'm a political scientist, so that's how I tend to approach these things in my work, at least. And part of that is kind of the social science enterprise of kind of looking at this along with a whole host of things, and trying to find ways to generalize and to categorize things. And obviously kind of rural urban is just a sharp dichotomy. But one of the ways social scientists try to grasp with this is, and add a little bit more nuance, is to, for instance, look at and categorize congressional districts or counties across the country on a scale, like a 6-point scale, ranging from pure rural to pure urban. And then there are kind of variations in there. And, that's very, very helpful in terms of being able to draw some general conclusions and to say, oh, well, okay, well, these counties in eastern Montana, actually, they're very similar to these counties in New Hampshire or what have you. One of the downsides of the social science enterprise, and that I think we'll be talking about a bit in this panel, is that you do sometimes lose a little bit of the nuance, the gray areas, the contradictions, the places where things don't fit easily into one category or another. And that's just kind of an inherent trade-off when you work kind of at the intersection of the social sciences and the humanities. And it's one I certainly have to grapple with. But I'll just say the other thing that I kind of use as my sort of central focus in approaching these things is, how it affects the overall health of our society, and especially the health of our political system, right? And we are increasingly polarized. And in my view, this threatens democratic institutions, small d democratic institutions, democratic norms that are essential for a democracy. And so one of the things I've been increasingly observant of and frankly concerned about is the degree to which in recent years our rural areas have gone sharply in one direction and our urban areas have gone sharply in another direction when it comes to politics. But then there are all these downstream effects of that that I think are worth all of our attention and worth thinking about how we might try to mitigate.
Yeah, Rob, let's make sure and come back to that. I want to know more about what you think some of the effects of that are. Germaine, do you have anything you want to add in terms of how you think about what the urban-rural divide is and how you've experienced it in your life?
Thanks, Amy. And thanks so much for inviting me to this conversation today. And thanks Humanities Montana for making this time possible. I appreciate this. So for me, Amy, it's not binary. It's not urban, rural. I consider myself Indigenous. So that's a very different, it's not about a particular place. Wherever I am here in this state, in the Northern Rockies, I'm at home. So it's not place specific. It's a different way of being in relationship with this place and with the natural world and with the people here. So I guess when I think about the urban-rural divide, I think that to be Indigenous is other, and we can maybe explore that more fully later in the conversation.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you bringing that perspective in, Germaine, and I would like to come back to that as well. It feels like all three of you just kind of laid out really interesting threads for us to follow up on during this time. So one thing I also just kind of wanted to mention, because I know there are some people who might be chiming in who are not from Montana, who might think like, wait a minute, is there such a thing as a rural urban divide in Montana? Because, from a perspective of someone in one of our country's larger cities, the whole state looks and feels rural. And yet those of us who live here know that there is a divide. I mean, I think all of us could easily spit out the stereotypes that we have about Missoula is this, and rural Montana is that, and so I kind of want to get a little bit of that just named for us here in terms of like localizing our conversation. What are some of the signatures, to the extent that we have a rural urban divide and relate to that concept at all? What are some of the signatures of it here in Montana specifically? And again, this is for any and all of you who want to chime in.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, what I think about, obviously there are lots of things we could say about that, and maybe some other people can speak to some of those other things. But the thing that stands out to me is that, at least from a kind of political science perspective, is that both of our rural areas and our urban areas have been increasingly polarized. And that's certainly true here in Montana, but it's true nationwide as well. And on some level, this is totally unsurprising, right? I mean, we shouldn't expect that urban areas have voting patterns that are exactly similar to rural areas, right? I mean, there are always these cleavages, and we see them along lines of gender and race and occupation and age and so on. And so there's, in that sense, there's nothing particularly surprising or even at first glance concerning about these differences between rural areas and urban areas. But what we have seen is that the margins are increasing pretty dramatically, right? So there's a big difference between, say, a rural county in eastern Montana going 60-40 for Republicans, as opposed to going 80-20, right? And increasingly, that's the kind of thing we're seeing in a lot of these rural counties in Montana. And in a lot of other places in the country, you look to our urban areas, which you don't have to go back all that long to see that Republicans were competitive in some of our urban areas. Increasingly, that is just not the case. And so there's an element of path dependence at work here, right? These things, once you get in one of these cycles, it's very easy for them to kind of spin out of control and just become more and more like themselves. And just as a political matter, I think this is a bigger problem for Democrats because we have an institution known as the United States Senate, in which states are the key entity. And so the rural influence is oversized in the Senate. It's also to a somewhat smaller degree a problem for the Electoral College. But I would say that this broader dynamic of political polarization in both rural and urban areas, it's an issue that all of us should be at least aware of, and I would suggest kind of concerned with, because some of the things that go along with having regional areas that are strongly Democratic or strongly Republican is that obviously fuels a decline in political competition. You have an increase in extremism. And I mean that both kind of within the standard confines of partisan politics, but also beyond. But just within the standard confines of partisan politics, we have now most politicians who are more concerned about getting primaried than they are about the general election, right? The thing they have to worry about is a member of their own party taking them out in the primary, not about going up against someone from the other party. And all of this is intertwined with negative partisanship, which is this dynamic in which people are less tied to their own party, but more oriented towards being strongly opposed to the other party, right? And all of this, I think, is a concern. Among other things, it seeps into all these other apolitical areas of our life. Right. And so things that I would say ought not be politicized become politicized. Right. So there's a political message that gets sent about what car you drive or what clothes you wear or the beer you drink or the public health protocols that you follow or don't follow. And all of these things. And I would also say, just as a final point on this, maybe, that these geographical divisions are arguably more concerning than some of those that we see around, occupational status or demographic groups or whatever, because some of the worst elements or episodes in American history, like the Civil War and Jim Crow, right? These sprung out of these intensely partisan geographic divides. And you could even point to things that are beyond kind of political violence, but other ills like the corruption of some of the old democratic urban machines, right? And so I do think, geographic polarization is a concern in a way that I think some other divides aren't quite as much of a concern.
Interesting. And Laura and Germaine, I wonder if you could bring some of those points home a little bit in terms of what are some of the ways that you are experiencing, uh, what are some of the signature things that you think most Montanans would be like, oh, that's a rural Montana thing, or that's an urban Montana thing. Ideas we have about each other that may or may not be fair, but that affect our thinking and our way of dealing with each other.
I think that once again, tribes are kind of an exception to the rule. Typically, Dems are urban and Republicans are not, but the exception to that are reservations. Tribal people are typically blue collar. They're very often veterans. An extraordinarily high number of tribal people are veterans. And, you know, I think that there have been significant efforts in the recent past to mobilize Indigenous communities and get them to vote. One of the interesting things I saw recently was the overlay of all of the Democratic blocs in Arizona that voted Democratic, that and how it was perfectly aligned with all of the reservation communities. So I think that in terms of voting, there's and just the political divide. Once again, tribes are a little anomalous to the nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And Laura, how's it looking from Big Timber?
Well, I guess when I think about your question, Amy, what are some of the signatures of a rural-urban divide in Montana? And when I think about that, I think that the signature of that divide is less about issues and more about the approach to that issues, or at least in my perspective. And as I studied agricultural history in our state over the last 100 years, what I noticed is that the issues that brought the sharpest divide were the issues in which rural people simply felt like they didn't have a voice in the decisions that impacted them the most, right? So that a person living out in the country didn't get a say in the issue that was going to most heavily affect their property rights or property taxes or other issues that you may have dealt with. Regardless of the issue, the underlying problem was that they didn't feel like they got to have a say in the issues that impacted them more than that issue impacted their city cousin, for example. So I think when we talk about the rural-urban divide, it becomes a conversation about people who do or do not have a voice in issues that impact them in their local communities or their local areas.
Yeah, well, I'd love to follow up on that a little bit. I think that's a really interesting way of framing it, and I think it also kind of ties into something that Rob was kind of mentioning earlier, in the sense that the reality is that, at least in our national politics, the Electoral College and definitely the Senate is actually skewed more the opposite way, that it kind of brings more power, per capita to rural places. And I guess I just wonder how much of that divide has to do with perception of, I wasn't consulted, I didn't have a chance to weigh in on this, versus the reality of it. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that, but.
Amy, I think that's a really good point. And I think that is fair to say, that there's a difference between the reality and the perception. And that certainly plays a role. But like I'm saying, I'm seeing a comment that says, Laura, give us an example of such an issue. And so I'll jump right into one that is probably, it's a very controversial issue. So I don't want to talk about the issue itself, but more about the feeling of the approach as I read the reports and the voices of rural people around this issue. So one would be the reintroduction of wolves in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Okay, so regardless of what you think about that issue or how you feel about it, there is a certain group of people who are rural people, landowners, who are going to be more heavily affected by the negative impact of that decision, right? So those are the people who are living next door to the Yellowstone ecosystem, and they're trying to make a living as ranchers, right? And they're going to carry the negative impacts of that decision. And so in a lot of the voices, again, as I'm studying this in this history book, a lot of the voices are saying it's not about the wolves, it's about giving us a seat at the table to say, to be recognized that we'll be negatively impacted by this, right? And so, for example, we'll say that that introduction happened in 97, right? But it wasn't until 2007 that the Livestock Loss Board was created to pay livestock producers when an animal was lost to predation, right? So there's a 10-year, a decade lag between the introduction of the wolf in the ecosystem to a recognition that, oh, we've got to do something for these people who have been impacted negatively by this decision. And that's what those voices were saying all along is, again, it's not about the wolf. It's about someone recognizing that there are consequences to these decisions.
Yeah, I think that kind of taps into some questions about who controls the narrative and kind of the perception in the media as well, because regardless of what might be happening politically, there's a whole other thing happening in terms of whose stories get represented and whose ideas are kind of given some kind of stamp of approval in the culture overall. Germaine, I'm curious about your thoughts about that, because that's something that in some of my reporting in Indigenous communities that I've heard over and over is just, we're tired of having people tell stories about us, but not actually be the people driving those narratives. And some of the exact same things that Laura was just speaking to, of like, we're tired of people making decisions that affect us, but we're not offered a true seat at the table to help shape those decisions. And I wonder if that's a place where some parts of Indian country maybe have some real shared alliances with more white rural areas in our state. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that there's an increasingly stark division between tribal communities and non-tribal communities, rural and urban communities in Montana. And while we've been talking about the rural-urban divide, I think that for us, oftentimes it's a conversation that's very specific to place. The stark divisions that have grown even more dramatic recently have to do with technology, healthcare, economics, education. These are areas where there where there are some issues that I think are important to talk about. So for example, in technology, 2019 Government Accountability Office report found tribes have lower levels of broadband access than the rest of the entire nation. And it found that the digital divide may be larger than federal officials originally estimated, because the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission data, overstated the availability on tribal lands. So turns out FCC doesn't have a formal process to collect data. And so over the last 8 years, less than 1% of broadband funding from federal programs went directly to tribes. So, there are issues that have to do very specifically with tribes. Another example is that, in terms of technology, that when Obamacare was rolled out, it was all web-based. So, you know, you had to register online. That was in 2010. So even fewer people had access to connectivity at that point. And, you know, I had less information about healthcare literacy. Interestingly enough, the federal government invests more in Department of Corrections healthcare than they do in Indian health on a per capita basis. So a prisoner who's incarcerated receives a higher investment in healthcare annually than an Indigenous person. So when we think about, you know, technology, healthcare, in terms of economics and the divide, 6 of 10 of the poorest cities in Missoula are on tribal lands. In Pablo, the seat of tribal government on our reservation, 47% live below the poverty line, and 23% of Polson residents live below the poverty line. So a third of the 6th poorest cities are on our reservation. You know, I can go on and on, but it really has to do with a long history of basically colonization and erasure of these issues. I'd love to talk about education, but I don't want to. I mean, those are just a couple of examples.
Yeah, yeah, and that's it. I thank you for bringing the data in. I did not know that about the 6 cities, and yeah, and just
6
every
poorest cities in the state.
Yeah, wow. And you know, that, I mean, that is a huge driver behind this whole conversation in general, I think, is this sense of economic hope, you know, and security and future. I just want to take a quick pause, though, to throw out another question to our audience so that you can respond to in the chat if you would like, which is connected to everything we're talking about, which is if you identify as an audience member, if you identify as a rural person, what are some of the stereotypes that you think people have about you? So if you're a rural person, we'd love to hear what you think people's stereotypes are about rural people, and vice versa. If you identify as an urban person, as an urban Montanan, what are some stereotypes that you think people have about that demographic? So just to be clear, this is not an opportunity to bash anyone, and we don't want you to like share stereotypes about the group that you're not a part of. But just, you know, for yourself, for your own community, what are some things that you think people perceive about you as a group? And, you know, some stereotypes are can even be fun and positive. It doesn't all have to be like heavy, horrible stuff. But we are kind of curious just to see how you might respond to that. But back to the panel conversation, you know, this whole concept, I think we've already started to deconstruct just a little bit, in the sense that the urban rural framework is so much set up as a dichotomy, as an either or. And several of you have already mentioned that you're kind of wary of those binaries, and as am I. I think they often leave things out, leave people out. So I'd love to hear more about how our lived realities in Montana complicate this whole concept of an urban-rural divide. And, you know, there are some people who maybe are shapeshifters, and they move back and forth between urban and rural, and they maybe don't even think about it that much. Maybe it's not that big of a deal. Or maybe there are people who just really don't feel like they identify with either of those categories, or maybe there's another identifier that feels more important, which I think is maybe what you were speaking to, Germaine. But yeah, what are some ways that our lived realities in Montana give the lie to this urban-rural divide framework?
Yeah, Amy, I think that's right, in the sense that, I mean, we move around a lot, and in a way, you would be reasonable to think that in the age of the internet and everything else, that actually some of these divisions would be lessening over time, not being exacerbated. And so that is kind of curious that a lot of the polarization we see is taking place despite all these different ways for us to be connected and in ways that have never been possible. I don't know to the extent that this is directly related to that or not, but one of the things that I think is notable, certainly in the political space, but also the cultural and social space, is how much things have become nationalized in terms of our media culture. You mentioned media earlier, and this was the role of local news for a long time provided political parties and political candidates a way to connect with people on ways that were very specific to local issues, right? So I'm thinking like a good example might be Max Baucus's work on the asbestos situation in Libya, right? And you had all these opportunities for people to target these very kind of hyper local issues that drew attention to those issues, as opposed to, the stuff on the cable news programs that's all about, well, who's in control of Congress, and it takes the focus off what some particular political leader is trying to do for this community and forging a connection with that community. And I would say unfortunate reality is that we've seen a decline in local news. And so that has had this odd way of kind of fueling and reinforcing these divides. But I think if we have any philanthropists out there, an interesting little project would be, or if you know some philanthropists, most of us aren't in a position to do this, but there would be a space out there for people with means to try to embark on a project of reinvigorating local media by subsidizing or straight up purchasing some of these local newspapers that have fallen on hard times and are at risk of closing down. Same with television stations, to try to bring back a little bit of those that opportunity to contextualize things in a local way. I think that has been lost. And so again, it's kind of curious. We have this kind of increasingly rigid divide, and yet it all kind of maps on and plays out in this very nationalized environment.
Yeah, and I think that's a very astute observation, because it's so connected. Because when things become larger and more general, they become more abstract, and then they become something that it's very easy to reduce down into something I'm either for or against. And the specific lived experience is much more complicated always. And Laura, as a person working in local media in a rural place, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. And I think that Rob brings up a really great point and an important point. I think it's easy when we look at maps and when we look at the kind of things that Rob was talking about earlier, and that when you look at a map of voting, you see these islands of red in our more populated areas, or excuse me, islands of blue and then seas of red around there. And I think that when we see that, we automatically think that, well, rural people are all of these stereotypes that we're seeing in the chat box, and urban people are all of the other stereotypes that we're seeing in the chat box. But what I find really interesting, and what we miss when we miss out on those local voices and those local news channels and those local conversations, is how people actually identify themselves in rural communities. And I'll share just one story that really stuck with me on an interview that I was on a couple years ago with a woman. And she was talking about being conservative and what that means. And I asked her, okay, what do you mean when you say that you're conservative? And she said, and I will never forget this, well, that means that you only need two, you don't buy 10 pairs of blue jeans when you only need 2. I need a go into town pair and I need a work pair. I don't need 10 pairs of blue jeans. I just need 2, and that's all I'm going to buy. And that's what it means to be conservative. And I thought, gosh, that is not what I think most people think of when they think of a conservative voter, right? They automatically think of this like far right, all these stereotypes that we're talking about. But when we don't have local voices and local news channels and local representation, we miss all of that reality of what we mean by the boxes that other people put us in.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when we do have local media, then we also need to read it and watch it and engage with it. And I think that's, the other side of the coin is that we're all, I think, increasingly seduced by the big giant story happening in a big other place. And it's almost like we sometimes are consuming news as entertainment, as like reality TV. And that's a very different thing than reading your local paper to find out about how the student did in the basketball game or how your neighbor, handled the storm last night. It's less dramatic, but it breaks down some of those simple categories. I love that definition of conservative. Germaine, in terms of this notion of complexifying and maybe deconstructing this urban-rural divide framework a little bit, I'd love for you to say a little bit more about what you started out with when you were saying, I actually identify as Indigenous, and that is maybe more my primary way of thinking about the world than as an urban person or as a rural person. And do you think that you're typical that way among Indigenous people in your community? And I'd just love to hear you say more about that concept in general.
Thanks, Amy. I agree with Laura. Rob brought some interesting points up just a moment ago when he said most people move around a lot. I think the average Montanan moves between 6 and 8 times in their career, in their lifetime. But for most tribal people, we've lived here for conservatively 12 to 14,000 years. So just the opposite is true, where many of us have this extraordinary experience that is based on thousands of years, millennia of observation, habitation, and experience on a very specific landscape. And and all of that information is passed from one generation to the next through stories, through direct contact, and it's so curious because I think that in many ways there has been a long history of erasure of Indigenous people, and that story has not been told. It began with genocide, removal, banning of religion, separating children from their families and sending them to schools like Carlisle, United States and Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania that ran from 1879 to 1918, and it was founded by Richard Pratt. He was the war general who famously said his goal was to kill the Indian, save the child. So there's been a tremendous history of through education, a colonization of our minds, of the mind, and colonization of thinking about Indigenous people and our place on the landscape.
Yeah, and how do you think that overlays with or doesn't this urban-rural divide that we're talking about? I'm curious if on the Flathead Reservation, do you think people that do you think that they would identify more as rural, or is it just not, that whole framework just isn't really of interest or isn't really the focus?
I don't think it's binary. And it was curious when you began the program and you asked people where they were from. For me, it is situational. Someone will ask me where I'm from, and if I might say the Mission Valley if they have very little familiarity with the landscape, or if it's somebody that if I'm in a gathering with other Indigenous people, I'll say from Flathead Res, or if I'm talking to somebody who lives on the reservation, I might say Sineatlaman. So I would give them the Salish name for the specific place that I live in, and it's really, it's based on experience and who I'm talking to. So it's very it's not binary.
Yeah, and you've learned the different sort of code switching and things that you need to do, probably from to be able to be understood by different people for a long time, I'm imagining. I have this whole list of questions over here, but I'm seeing our time just like flying by, and it feels like it's important to bring in more questions from the audience. So Samantha, do we have a couple of questions we want to bring in here, or should I throw out more of my own?
We have a lot of questions, but people are also answering their own questions, like other people in the audience are answering, which is great. There's a whole other conversation happening in the chat, which is amazing. I've tried to save a couple of them as they've come up, and one, Carla asked, what's the nexus between the rural-urban divide and racism? And Barbara asked, would the panel discuss these issues with a framework of class or caste? So I think there are some questions there about how other identities layer on top of this rural-urban identity.
Wow, yeah, those are fantastic questions. Do any of you want to take a stab at that?
I think that's a great question, and I think that I talked a little bit about a history of erasure of Indigenous people, and I think that as I said, first by Indian wars and removal from homeland, but also the removal of knowledge itself by forced assimilation and undermining our knowledge by calling it myth, legend, or folklore, telling us that Indigenous knowledge is not as rigorous as science, that that it can't be evidence-based, when in truth it's based on millennia of experience and habitation and occupancy of this very landscape. So it's incredibly rich and very specific. And what I think is important now is to begin this decolonization of our language and of our minds, and really really encouraging social leaders and elders that are providing this training that validates experience of people, and reminding our children and our young people that a bull trout isn't just a fish. It was one of the ways that we were able to not just subsist, but really flourish as ecotone people. We don't have stories of starvation winters when the bison weren't available, or if there was if the root crops failed, we had this incredible gift. So I'm sorry, I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that we have to rethink some things about, we have to begin to reimagine our relationship with this place and our relationship with each other, and think beyond the binary.
And that I am hearing you saying that does overlay with race and caste to a certain extent. Is that right, Germaine?
It has historically. Mm-hmm. And I think that I think that we're really we're changing that. We're decolonizing language, and we're doing that for our children and their children and all of the children who aren't yet born that we will love.
Laura,
may I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I want to ask a question back to Germaine and just hear your thoughts on what role you think that celebrating culture and sharing that historic knowledge, does that education and celebration have a role in bridging those divides or gaps that you're talking about?
Absolutely. I think that that's one of the most important ways that we can bridge that gap by, by singing, by dancing, by having feasts, having celebrations. I mean, those are the ways that we come together with open-mindedness and a desire to pass the inheritance of cultural magnificence on, not to our children, but also to share that with visitors and strangers that have come to this landscape as well. We've been gifted with cultural magnificence, and it's something that we feel a burden of responsibility to share.
Rob, I wonder about, from the political science perspective, what you know about this question about how race and caste overlay with the urban-rural divide. What, in Montana specifically, when we see some rural counties in Montana going, really hard for very right-wing candidates, how much can we attribute that to racial fears or racial prejudices?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the social science data out there would suggest that there's that there's an element of truth in that. On the other hand, one thing that we haven't talked about, I think directly, is that certainly in sometimes when you talk about rural America, I think we kind of automatically think of kind of white rural America, either kind of like hillbilly elegy type of rural America, or in Montana, white rural America. But of course, and we have touched on this a bit, it's more complicated than that. Certainly in the South, there are very large pockets of African American rural areas. But I think for white rural America, and for some of these counties that you were referencing here in Montana, there is this perception, and I would tend to say that it's more than a perception, that there's at least some reality to it, of a real kind of cultural condescension and from urban areas. And there is some social science work to suggest that actually there's more resentment from rural areas towards urban areas than there actually is from urban areas to rural areas. However, the dominant culture, I think, out there in our media ecosystem and everything else does kind of, and look, I'm here in Missoula, a university town. I spend my time at the university. But there is this sense from kind of the intellectual elite, from the media elite, from the cultural elite, the Hollywood elite, that rural areas are of the problem, right? That a lot of the problems with America are basically, if not with rural areas, then at least with the people who live in the rural areas. And and that's of course fueled by the nationalization that I was talking about earlier. But I think that sense is pretty pervasive, and there's quite a bit of polling data to back that up. And that, of course, I think kind of fuels some of these other pathologies.
Interesting. I'd love to hear maybe another question from the audience, but I just can't move away from this particular question without getting your take too, Laura.
Thanks, Amy. I don't know that I have a good answer for that question. I would echo Rob's comment on this idea of cultural condensation and this resentment between rural voices. And I think, again, that comes back to this idea of urban elite versus rural. And I think that does exist, whether or not it is reality.
That perception of being condescended to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Spoken down to. Again, when we look at, I'm following the chat section along and saying that, rural people are less educated. And I think a lot of rural people have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder when they hear that, because they think, well, I don't need a university education to be intelligent. And so there are, and that's very true. And so there are different values that different people place on different things, right? That degree doesn't equal education in many senses. But that's a different, I think that's a different viewpoint that rural people have because of their time and experience in other areas.
Mhm. You know, I can speak from my own experience, just having grown up in a rural area, that I was definitely aware of negative stereotypes about rural people, and was aware of that feeling of being condescended to. But I will say that as I've grown more, I think I also noticed, though, increasingly, that there are a lot of biases and condescensions coming from rural areas too, that I don't necessarily feel like maybe in some rural places that people get called out on to examine biases going in the other direction, you know. And there are, I mean, how many times have we heard people, you know, making fun of the latte drinking, blah, 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 the ivory tower, the pinhead, the da, da, da. And I mean, and there's, I mean, some of it's like, just, you know, have a little bit of a thick skin, and like there is some truth to all of that, and it can be funny and it can be fine. But there's a darker side to it too, in the way that I think it can overlay, especially with race, and that people can perceive, you know, cities and urban areas as dangerous and threatening, and you know, as a problem. And a lot of that can be code for, there are people there who don't look like me, and I don't actually know how to deal with that. And so I guess to me, Germaine, this is just something I'd be interested to hear from you on, because there are so many rural parts of Montana that are not white, where that all seems like it might very much come to a head, where it's like the uh, some of the racist attitudes when people who might have some of those racist attitudes are neighbors with people of color, with Indigenous people who are also rural. And I'm not sure exactly what my question is, sorry, but I'm just wondering how you may have experienced that, or if you have thoughts on that.
You know, that is an interesting question. Throughout my decades and decades of living on Flathead Reservation, what I've observed is that it's one of the areas in Montana that has some of the largest hate groups in the state. So there, all through the decades, there have been anti-Indian hate groups on the reservation, and oftentimes very, very vocal, and have at different times they have organized and protested. There have been things like tractor rallies that have blocked Highway 93. They have met in high school gymnasiums. There have been huge protests against tribal people. And then on the other hand, there have always been enough good people. There have been, you know, we're the majority landowners on our reservation, and through a whole series of treaties that were abrogation of treaties, there have been openings to the reservation that mean that we're the minority population on our reservation, but majority land owners, and that's caused some tension between people, but and significant conflict. But as I said, there have always been enough good people that choose to live on the reservation because they value Class 1 air quality, Class 1 water quality, that it's a nuclear-free reservation, that we have maintained thousands of wetland areas, and the you know, the millions of acres that we have as tribal land, we have chosen to share with other people through the purchase of a small fee, a recreation use permit. And so we have tried to be we have tried to be good neighbors. And we have also very seriously taken the obligation to maintain this landscape for all future generations and the resources that are on there. So we have restored all of the resources that were there before visitors and strangers arrived. So there are grizzly bears, there are wolves, there are peregrine falcons, there, you know, the whole circle of life that is there now. And there are, as I said, enough good people that value that and choose to live there. So there are a few people that are hugely opposed to the tribes and tribal sovereignty and tribal issues. And unfortunately, some of them are representatives of local government. But there are enough good people.
That's good to hear. Sam, do you have more questions from the audience you want to bring in?
Yeah, we're getting close to the end, but it might be nice to end with one of these. So a lot of people in the chat have brought this up in different ways, but John asks, what are and what can be the methods to increase dialogue between rural and urban groups? And Nancy was agreeing with something that Rob had said, but asked, can he address what can be done about this divide? We all know there is a divide. What can we do to bring people together?
That's wonderful. That was on my list of things I wanted to end with too. So thank you, panel or audience, for doing that work for me. And yeah, Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's obviously what needs to happen. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but the whole nationalization of everything, I think, is a big part of the problem. So we need to figure out a way, I think, to draw some attention away from Fox News and MSNBC and all of that, and refocus it on local issues. And so, I mean, to me, one of the big things is to try to revitalize local media. And I mentioned philanthropy earlier, and if any of you have the means to do that, there are opportunities there to try to support local and statewide media outlets. But all of us can do that a little bit, and I suspect many of the people on here already do that to some degree or another. But get a subscription to your local paper and support public media. These kinds of things, and just in general, maybe take some breaks now and again from national media, because there's a lot more going on. And I mentioned the Libby example with Max Baucus earlier. I can guarantee you that Sean Hannity and Rachel Maddow, they don't know about Libby and they don't care, right? So there's a lot more going on out there than just the partisan dynamics back in Washington, D.C., which is what fuels all of the national media.
Yeah. Laura and Germaine, what are some things that are, maybe to make it a little simpler, what is like one thing we could do to help bridge this urban-rural divide as Montanans?
Well, I would echo Rob's comment of being more deeply embedded in our own local communities and being open to hearing all of the voices that entails. And we all have a lot of work to do on that. I think that there are a lot of examples, a lot of the conversations, or I think a lot of the conflict points, and when we talk about rural urban, is around, in Montana, is around natural resource issues, land use issues, private and public land issues. And I think we have a lot of examples across the state right now that are doing a really good job of place-based landscape collaboration. There's the Blackfoot Challenge over in the Ovando in Western Montana. I work with a group called the Rancher Stewardship Alliance in North Central Montana. There are several of these different organizations around the state who have focused on bringing together a variety of voices who are connected to landscapes and these natural resource issues in a variety of ways. And I think that's a really important step to solving some of these challenges, just so that we're all at the same table and hearing different stories.
Yeah, and that, I mean, it connects with something I think that all of us probably heard in the lead up to the last election, which is that the one thing that seems to unite Montanans is our love for this place and the uniqueness of our state in terms of the land and the wildlife and all of the natural resources. And that does really seem to be a cross-cutting issue, and that feels quite hopeful. Germaine, can we give you the last word? What's something that we can do to bridge these divides?
Amy, I think you just said it. I think coming together with open hearts and open minds, that joy of being, learning something new and learning something that binds us together. I think that, and most importantly, as Ron and Laura said, we have a shared love of this place. And that's a foundational issue. That's something that I think is, can't be understated. I think that's important for all of us to think about and reflect on, and move beyond the partisan divide, the other divides that keep us separate, particularly during this time when it's a time of such chaos and confusion and separation. The one thing that we share and the one thing that we have in common is the beauty of the natural world that surrounds us, and our love for it, our shared love for it.
Well, that seems like a lovely note to end on. Thank you all so much, panelists, for your insights and your thoughtfulness in this conversation. And thanks so much to the audience for all of your questions and ideas. I haven't been able to track the chat super well while being involved in the conversation, but I'm seeing little things pop up, and it's really fun that you're so engaged and that you're here. I'll hand it back to Sam and Humanities Montana. A huge thank you again to you, Humanities Montana folks, for making this happen.
Thank you, Amy, and thanks to everyone for participating in tonight's talk. We would love to hear your feedback. If you could take a few minutes to fill out the survey that Ryan is about to drop in the chat there. Thank you especially to our panelists, Laura, Germaine, and Rob, and to Amy for moderating. I'd also like to thank Emily Niles for live captioning this event to make it more accessible for everyone. I hope you can join us for the next panel in the Why It Matters series, The Native Vote, on March 3rd. Ryan will drop a link to register for that. And our panelists will include University of Montana School of Journalism professor Jason Begay, who has covered political disenfranchisement in Montana tribal communities, Marcy McLean, who is the executive director of Montana Native Vote, and U.S. Staff Sergeant and Crow Reservation organizer, Lori Dawn Kindness. Finally, if you are moved by this conversation and would like to help support future programs like this, please consider donating to Humanities Montana. We appreciate the support our community shows us in bringing the humanities into our daily lives. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.